This is some farmland in Ukraine, a nation known as the breadbasket of Europe. 10% of the global wheat market, 15% of the global corn market, and 50% of the world's sunflower oil comes from fields just like this all over the country. However, a significant portion of these fields are not owned by Ukraine. They're actually owned by China. One prominent example as to why this is in 2013, Xinjiang Production and Construction Corp., a Chinese state-owned company, struck a deal to lease 7.5 million acres of Ukrainian farmland, nearly 9% of all of the land in Ukraine. Think about that. One Chinese company owning almost a tenth of the land of another country, essentially becoming the largest landowner and food producer of Ukraine. And this is not just an isolated incident. This has been happening all over the world for decades. And eventually, as I started mapping all of this out, it became apparent that China has a secret empire that no one really talks about. Once upon a time, in a world not yet dominated by smartphones, social media, and 24/7 surveillance, China was busy figuring out how to feed more than 1 billion mouths. The country was already a global economic powerhouse in waiting, but there was a nagging issue. The land situation back home wasn't exactly what you'd call abundant. With 9% of the world's arable land and 20% of the world's population, China was in a bit of a food pickle. The vast landscapes of rolling rice paddies and serene farmland couldn't keep up with an exploding population and a growing middle class with new culinary demands. As the decades passed and China continued to industrialize, urbanize, and devour its own resources, the leadership in Beijing had a eureka moment. Why not just buy the world's farmland? Problem solved, right? Now let's rewind a little bit to understand how that plan kind of came to be. In the mid-20th century, China's land and agriculture strategy was a very domestic affair. After all, the country was dealing with its own tumultuous history of famine and industrialization, thanks to the Great Leap Forward, which I made a few videos about on this channel. By the 1980s, though, things started to look better, with the country adopting a series of economic reforms that finally started to fill its grain silos. But even as the country's agriculture output grew, the alarm bells started ringing in Beijing. Chinese soil, long exploited and degraded, was becoming less productive. Desertification was creeping in, rivers were running dry. Add to this the rapid urbanization that was gobbling up arable land faster than you can say a ghost city. And the picture was becoming clear. China needed a plan B. By the 1990s, Chinese leaders knew that their country couldn't rely on its own farmland alone. They were already importing huge amounts of soybeans, corn, and other staples, and those numbers were only getting bigger. With food security becoming a national obsession, China's gaze started drifting beyond its borders. You see, China is nothing if not pragmatic. Why waste time trying to rehabilitate exhausted domestic land when there's a whole world of fertile soil out there just waiting to be acquired? But it wasn't just about food. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, China's leaders were crafting their master plan to dominate key global resources: energy, water, minerals, and of course, farmland. They'd been watching the West play the game of global resource acquisition for decades and thought, hey, we can do that too, and we'll do it bigger and faster. And so, China was about to embark on a globe-spanning shopping spree that would make land barons of old blush. They were about to realize that when it comes to feeding 1 billion plus people, you need more than just your own backyard. You need the world. So now we arrive at China in the 2000s, and their logic is simple. If you can't grow enough food to feed your own people at home, go buy other people's land and grow it there. After all, who cares if some countries need that land for themselves when you have 1.4 billion hungry mouths to feed? And thus began China's real-life version of monopoly, where the stakes were global, the properties were enormous, and the rules were, well, let's just say, a bit flexible. Now, Africa was China's first big stop on the global land buying spree. Why? Simple. Plenty of arable land, weak property laws, and governments eager to attract foreign investment. Perfect. It didn't take long before Chinese state-owned companies started making themselves comfortable across the continent. Take ZTE International, for example. This telecom giant wasn't just interested in wiring up Africa with new cell towers. They were also after 2.8 million hectares, which is about 7 or so million acres of land in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to grow palm oil. And ZTE wasn't alone. Chinese firms were scooping up land for biofuels and food production in countries like Ethiopia, Zambia, and Mozambique. By 2014, Chinese companies had laid claim to at least 5 million hectares. That's about 12.35 million acres of African land. Much of it in deals that would make a seasoned negotiator wince. These deals often involved leasing land for 99 years, but at such bargain rates that local farmers couldn't dream of competing. But China wasn't only interested in food crops, they also wanted to secure raw materials, and Africa was happy to oblige. Sino-Hydro, a Chinese hydropower company, didn't just build dams, they grabbed millions of acres of land in Ghana and Sudan for agricultural projects. The idea? Turn these vast African plains into food factories for China's insatiable appetite. However, Africa's not the only place rich in farmland, and China wasn't going to stop there. South America was the next big target, particularly Brazil and Argentina, where soybeans grow like weeds. China needs soy. Lots of it. In fact, China imports around 60% of the world's soybeans, mostly for livestock feed. So naturally, they figured, why not just cut out the middleman and own the land where it's grown? In 2011, the Beidahang Group, one of China's largest state-owned agricultural firms, set its sights on Argentina. They negotiated a deal to lease about 1 million acres of fertile farmland in Patagonia. The plan? Grow soybeans and other crops to send directly back to China. And Argentina, struggling with its own economic woes, was more than happy to let Beidahang strike a deal. Meanwhile, in Brazil, COFCO, China's largest food company, was making moves. They invested heavily in Brazilian agri-business, securing vast tracts of land for soybean production. By 2020, COFCO had firmly established itself as one of Brazil's top grain traders, with direct control over thousands of acres of farmland. Then there is Uruguay, a small country with some of the most fertile land in all of South America. Chinese investors, mostly through joint ventures, quietly gobbled up land for beef and grain production. By the mid-2010s, Chinese firms controlled large chunks of Uruguay's agricultural output. Now, China's land grab didn't just stop in the developing world. Oh no. They had their eyes set on Eastern Europe too, where fertile soil was plentiful, regulations were, let's say, flexible, and land was still relatively cheap. Ukraine, known as the breadbasket of Europe, was a prime target. In 2013, as kind of mentioned already, Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps made headlines with a controversial deal to lease 3 million hectares, or about 7.5 million acres, of Ukrainian farmland. That's roughly the size of Belgium, by the way. The plan was simple: grow corn, wheat, and other crops on Ukrainian soil, ship them back to China, and boom, you got yourself some food security. Although this particular deal faced pushback and was eventually scaled down a little bit, it was clear that China wasn't just interested in importing food from Europe. They wanted to control its production. Romania also saw its fair share of Chinese interest. By the late 2010s, Chinese investors had quietly acquired thousands of hectares of prime Romanian farmland. Companies like China National Agricultural Development Group focused on large-scale grain and livestock production, with a portion of the crops being exported directly to China. And now let's not forget China's neighbors. In Laos, for instance, Chinese firms have bought up large swaths of agricultural land to grow rubber, bananas, and rice. Chinese investors leased hundreds of thousands of hectares of land for agriculture and plantation farming, sometimes displacing local communities in the process. Laos has effectively become China's backyard garden. Myanmar, Cambodia, and other Southeast Asian nations followed suit. Chinese companies moved in, sometimes with sweetheart deals, securing land for both food and non-food agriculture, like rubber plantations, to meet China's growing demands. We also have Australia, the land of kangaroos, beaches, and apparently Chinese farmland. You bet, in 2016, China's Shanghai Zhongfu Group purchased a 43,000-hectare farming estate in northern Australia, with plans to grow sugarcane. This was just one of many land acquisitions by Chinese companies in Australia. In fact, by 2021, Chinese investors controlled nearly 9 million hectares of Australian farmland, about 1% of the country's total agricultural land. Now let's not forget the corporate players here. Chinese state-owned giants like COFCO, Baidahang, and Bright Food have been at the forefront of these land acquisitions. COFCO in particular has transformed itself into a global agribusiness behemoth, controlling key farmlands not just in South America and Europe, but also in Southeast Asia as well. These companies don't just want to buy land, they want to dominate the entire supply chain, from farm to fork. Most of these land deals have been bankrolled by Chinese state-owned banks, like the China Development Bank and Export-Import Bank of China. These institutions provide the capital for land acquisitions, often under the gaze of Belt and Road Initiative investments. The goal? To secure food security while simultaneously expanding China's geopolitical influence. But now, we are in 2024, and China's playing Monopoly, and they've pretty much won the game already. Their strategy of snapping up farmland around the world bit by bit has paid off, as countries are waking up to what just happened. China is calmly sitting at the head of the global food table, ready to serve itself and its 1.4 billion citizens, while the rest of the world scrambles for scraps. China, once worried about how it would feed its population, is now in the driver's seat, thanks to millions of hectares it controls across Africa, South America, and Eastern Europe. China has diversified its food sources to a level that would make any strategist proud. Remember all of the soy from Brazil? The corn from Ukraine? The beef from Uruguay? Well, guess where most of it's heading? Straight to China, where it's helping fuel the rise of the middle class with a growing taste for meat, dairy, and all the trappings of a more westernized diet, which may not exactly be the best thing, let's be honest. By now, China controls or has a stake in the production of more than 10% of the world's arable land outside of China. It may not seem like much, but when you consider that it's strategically placed in key agricultural regions like Brazil's soy fields, Africa's emerging markets, and Ukraine's breadbasket, it becomes clear that China is no longer just a player in the global food system. They're running the show. They've gone from being one of the world's biggest food importers to controlling the flow of some of the most crucial crops on the planet. You've got to give them a little bit of credit. It's a pretty brilliant strategy. While other nations are busy squabbling over oil, rare earth metals, and tech supremacy, China quietly locked down the one resource that no one can live without: food. Oh, and they're not just hoarding it. China is starting to flex its muscles in the global food market, and this is where things get really interesting. Remember how everyone used to talk about China's debt trap diplomacy? Well, meet its more subtle cousin: food diplomacy. When you own a significant portion of the world's food supply, you can pretty much call the shots on who gets what. And China is starting to use its agricultural empire as a geopolitical tool. Need soybeans or wheat? Sure, but maybe you'll have to agree to a trade deal or two. Need rice to feed your population? No problem, just don't forget to show some diplomatic goodwill. It's a soft power play that makes traditional diplomacy look quaint. Take Africa, for instance. Countries like Zambia, Ethiopia, and Ghana have found themselves in a peculiar situation. On one hand, they're grateful for the infrastructure and development brought by the Chinese investment. On the other hand, they're becoming more dependent on Chinese-controlled food production. China doesn't need to send troops or economic hitmen to these countries. They already own the farms that feed them. By 2024, China's control over food isn't just about keeping its own people fed, it's about reshaping the global food supply chain. With companies like COFCO and Baidahang leading the charge, China isn't just farming the land, they're controlling the logistics, the export routes, and the markets. This gives China incredible leverage over global food prices and supply. If they want to flood the market with soy or wheat, they can. If they want to cut off supply to drive up prices, they can do that too. And here's the kicker: as droughts or floods or anything affects agricultural places all around the world, China is in the enviable position of having diversified its food sources across multiple continents. While other countries may struggle with droughts, floods, or crop failures, like I mentioned, China can simply shift its imports from one region to another. Oh, the wheat crop in Ukraine is bad this year? No worries, Brazil's soy crop is booming. It's almost like they saw this coming. So what does this mean for the rest of us poor souls who didn't have the foresight to buy up all of the farmland? Well, we're in for a little bit of a bumpy ride, we can say. As China consolidates its control over food production, other countries are starting to feel the pinch. For nations that rely heavily on imports, like much of the Middle East and North Africa, China's dominance in the food market means they are at the mercy of Beijing's agricultural policies. This is a game of power, and China holds all of the cards. Then there's the issue of food sovereignty. In countries like Argentina and Ukraine, local farmers are becoming increasingly reliant on Chinese investment. While these countries may still technically own the land, the reality is that China controls the output. This is leading to growing concerns about what happens if China decides to shift its priorities or pull out of these regions. It's not just about losing investment, it's about losing the ability to feed your own people. Meanwhile, other global players, the US, Europe, and Russia, are watching all of this with a growing sense of unease. The US, long accustomed to being the world's agricultural superpower, is suddenly realizing that it's not just oil pipelines it should be worried about, it's food supply chains. Russia, with its vast expanses of farmland, is also eyeing China's moves closely, and Europe, which has traditionally relied upon importing food from regions like Ukraine and Africa, is suddenly waking up to the fact that much of that food now has China's fingerprints all over it. Now that we know that China's firmly entrenched in the global food market, what's next? Well, we're already seeing them expand into technology-driven agriculture. China is investing heavily in agri-tech, from AI-powered farming to genetically modified crops. The goal? To squeeze even more food production out of the land they already control. They're also looking at new frontiers like vertical farming and hydroponics, which could revolutionize how food is grown in urban environments. If China controls the future of agriculture, it's game over for anyone still stuck in the old ways of farming. In short, China has successfully turned farmland into a geopolitical tool, one that rivals oil and rare earth metals. They've secured their food supply, created new levers of influence over other nations, and positioned themselves as major players in the global economy for years to come. For the rest of the world, well, better start looking into some sustainable alternatives, because the days of cheap, abundant food are starting to look a lot less certain. So the next time you sit down for a meal, just remember, there's a pretty good chance that China had a hand in growing it, shipping it, or controlling the supply of it. Bon appetit! Thanks for watching.